Vaitheeswaran. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Australian Chamber of Commerce webinar with Vijay Vaitheeswaran. We're going to be talking about the future of energy, resources, and climate change in a disruptive world. My name is Stephanie Evener. I'm the Chief Executive of AustCham Hong Kong. And on behalf of AustCham, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. As you know, AustCham Hong Kong is a platform to support member business, facilitate business connections and networking opportunities. We're an independent organisation and our work is made possible through the generous support of our members. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our Platinum patrons for their ongoing financial support and engagement with the Chamber. ANZ Bank, Chow Tai Fook Enterprises, Chung Kong Infrastructure Holdings, China Light and Power, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Leighton Asia, National Australia Bank, Telstra, and the University of Wollongong College in Hong Kong. Now to some housekeeping. This event will be recorded and we are in webinar format. That means you can see myself and Vijay, but you can't see or interact with each other. We have enabled the Q&A function and the chat function, so I encourage you to send questions in through that and I will receive them and share them with our speaker. And this is a live event. Vijay is joining us here from New York in his evening. And sometimes in live events, the unexpected can happen, especially online. So please stick with us if we happen to run into any issues. Now to our speaker, Vijay Vaitheeswaran, Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor from The Economist and host of a great podcast on climate change called To a Lesser Degree. His editorial responsibilities at The Economist range from business and finance to technology and innovation, and he's produced numerous cover stories and won awards for his reporting. He's also the author of 3 well-received books and an accomplished public speaker. The Financial Times declared you, Vijay, to be a writer to whom it's worth paying attention. From 2017 to 2021, you served as New York-based US business editor, and you opened the magazine's first Shanghai bureau in 2012, served as its China business editor until mid-2017. You led the editorial team that launched the Economist Global Business Review, a successful app, and it's the first bilingual product offered by The Economist in its 180-year history. Vijay, we are thrilled to welcome you here today. Thank you for making the time for us. We have lots to discuss, and we're going to start with a topic that is big. It's impacting everyone everywhere. It's been going on for several months and rather unexpected in some ways, the war in Ukraine. It's with Russia, a major energy supplier. I want to start our conversation to talk about what you're seeing insofar as the impact of the war in Ukraine on global energy markets.
Sure. First of all, let me say it's terrific to be with you. Thank you for having me, and to hopefully engage with your members as well in conversation after we talk for a little while. There's no doubt that the war in Ukraine is going to last a while. This is not something that's likely to be over anytime soon. But it also comes at a time, again, if we look at this with an energy filter, as you've asked me to do, the war in Ukraine and the shock that has rippled through global energy markets as a result of it, we'll all know the impact on the oil price, but as well natural gas and LNG markets have been affected, as well as many other commodities. This did not happen in a vacuum. We were coming into a situation in which we already had very tight oil markets, in part because of the pandemic and the recovery that we saw last year in a very robust recovery in all forms of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas soared dramatically at a time when, for example, the OPEC oil cartel was unable to meet its own quotas for various reasons. Some of them pandemic related, that is staff shortages in Nigeria, and technical reasons. They shut down production so quickly when the pandemic hit that there were some technical reasons why they couldn't bring production back so quickly. And we've seen this during other cycles in oil. And so we were already in a very tight situation in terms of supply in oil that had pushed prices towards $100. And of course, then we saw the uncertainty of war, as well as some of the pain of sanctions and the disruption of sanctions avoidance and so-called self-sanctioning behavior, which is relatively novel. We can talk about all these things if you'd like, but the context I'm trying to give is that this was on top of an already precarious oil market. And there's similar stories we can get into about how the natural gas markets in Europe in particular and the LNG markets, we saw a price shock last winter, of course, that rippled throughout the global LNG markets with strong impacts in Asia, diversion of cargoes, fuel switching back to coal in a number of cases. And so that was the context in which we saw the war push us into what I would put to you is the greatest energy shock since the 1970s. That's going to have longer term consequences than just what we see today.
Vijay, I want to pick up on something you mentioned there around commodity prices. You know, some of these factors have led to a sharp rise in commodity prices, oil, coal, etc. And if we accept that in recent periods, those were at some historical lows, it's now turning that they're more valuable out of the ground than in the ground. And we've seen countries start to really focus on areas, developing their own energy sources. The America with shale is a great example, I think, that's been ongoing. I mean, what do you see as the impact that this really great interest and a fossil renaissance is having on the global climate aspirations?
Well, I think you ask a question that's central to the longer term future of the global economy, and that is, to put a sharp point on it, is the renaissance in fossil fuels going to set back climate ambition by half a decade or perhaps a decade? I think that's really the hard question that we have to come to grips with. We'll all remember the enthusiasm of the UN's COP26 summit that was held in Scotland towards the end of last year, though obviously promises made at UN summits should not all be taken at face value. There was certainly a sense of ambition as well as concern about how much time has been lost in chasing after climate goals, a renewing of commitments to increase the penetration of renewable energy in Europe, for example, as well as advance hydrogen, something that Australia has a strong interest in, green hydrogen as an export opportunity, as well as Chile and Saudi Arabia, interestingly, in North Africa. There are a number of places where we could see entirely new markets and global economies emerging. And that mood has rather been soured by the rise of energy security, of the need to get off Russian gas in the case of Germany, but more broadly, keeping the lights on. And what energy wonks like to call the energy trilemma. Of course, economics or cost is always one of the pillars governments have to think about. A second one is environment. And in this case, climate change had really come to dominate the agenda in thinking about energy. But the neglected one, the third pillar, as it were, of the trilemma was security. Security of supply, as in where you get your resources, not from dodgy places, but also security of the grid, keeping the lights on, making sure Granny doesn't freeze in the middle of winter, which became a real challenge last winter in Europe because of how Europe had arranged its markets for spot pricing in gas and so on. And so all of these have been called into question. And I was just in the Permian Basin where the American shale drillers are going gangbusters. You couldn't find a spare rig in Texas or Oklahoma at this point, or in New Mexico. You know, as I landed, there was so many wells were being dug that they couldn't get enough room in the distribution system. There were flaring gas. There were at least 20 enormous flares that I could see just on my drive from the airport to my hotel in Midland, Texas. That's obviously not great for climate change. We shouldn't be flaring. It was for safety reasons. They had to do it. But nevertheless, this is going to lead to an enormous challenge on the climate front, is what I put to you.
Yeah. I want to come back to Australia's role, both at COP and also in terms of its opportunity in green energy transition. But let's stick with Europe for now. You mentioned, you know, Europe and LNG and the kind of unattended side effects of Europe, you know, really taking up a lot or finding alternatives to Russia's supply. You know, what do you see, I guess, as the impact in other parts of the world of that of that issue in relation to Europe's needs?
So we can see, if we look at the last 12 months, because Europe has been scrambling for gas, not just because of the Russia problem. It was true even before with the price shock and the winter shock that we saw before the invasion of Ukraine. We know that LNG, particularly cargoes that ship from the United States, can be diverted to the highest bidder, right? They're often written into the clauses. That's not necessarily true for cargoes of LNG from, say, Qatar or other places, or the piped gas from Russia, of course. Pipes can only go where they go, and so that's a lot harder to divert. But America is now once again the superpower of oil and gas, as it was 100 years ago when America supplied the world, and that's the trajectory is back on again. And those cargoes were diverted last winter, and once again, those that can be bid for will go to the highest price. In this case, it's probably going to be Europe because of a security imperative to get off that Russian gas. And the impact we see, one, the customers in Asia who are willing to forfeit that, and of course, their profit as well. We know that a number of Chinese state-owned companies happily sold this LNG to make a nice profit, and there's a capacity to increase coal production, for example, coal-fired production. In other words, fuel switching, or to use dirtier, resid oil and so on. So we see this in the data that we saw oil and coal consumption increase, in part because of that fuel switching effect and LNG cargoes being diverted. But there's some markets that don't have that choice. In Japan and Korea, you can't burn dirty oil so easily, and so they have less capacity, or markets that don't have that extra coal. And you see in markets like India or in the emerging markets of Africa, which had hoped to use LNG as part of the dash to gas to get off of coal, be suddenly being priced out or having to pay very high prices for them for what they had anticipated than what they had budgeted for. And so I think we're going to see knock-on consequences of having a very motivated buyer in Europe willing to buy enormous amounts of LNG. That's going to have ripple effects, and not all of those consequences are going to be good.
I mean, you mentioned Japan, Korea, China, they're Australia's biggest customers for LNG. I mean, do you think this is an opportunity for Australia?
Well, we have to distinguish on time frames, right? There's a short-term crisis and a short-term response, and that has to be put in the context of a market like LNG, which I know your sophisticated members would know is really one that requires long time scales, right? The investment horizons are measured in many years. And even something that the headlines trumpeted recently, which is President Biden's offer to send American LNG to Europe. Ironically, that's what Donald Trump offered. They're called molecules of freedom, and it was ridiculed widely as a sort of transparent ruse to favor American industry and so on. Europeans were having a good joke about it. That's basically the new Biden policy, to offer molecules of freedom, gas from America to go to Europe. The hard truth is that America's export capacity at its LNG terminals is absolutely maxed out. There's no extra capacity to ship those molecules of freedom to Europe. Secondly, those cargoes are already committed. The next major LNG terminal to come online has the owner of that terminal and of that gas said at an oil conference fairly recently in Houston that I was attending that is completely sold out to the 2040s, and almost all of those cargoes are meant to go to Asia on long-term contracts. Europeans, because of the posture the European Commission and governments took about gas, they were very relaxed about reliance on Russian gas, and they did not favor long-term contracts. In fact, they were hostile to long-term contracting because they wanted to encourage competition in the marketplace. They favored the spot markets. And so these American exporters could not get long-term contracts from European utilities for 20 years. Which is the standard you need to get long-term contracts, 15, 20 years. As well, because one utility boss told me he doesn't know if gas is going to be allowed in the European market 20 years from now, or will be priced out through carbon pricing, through regulations, and so on, because Europe has such aggressive climate goals. Natural gas is supposed to be phased out. And so what's the point of contracting for 20 years and locking yourself in and being out of the money? And so for this variety of disincentives that Europe had put in place, it found itself in an incredibly vulnerable position. But we know that there's a long-term play here, and not, the next year or two, we're going to see the spot markets respond. But those long-term cargoes are much slower to move, like a super tanker. But only if you start turning the wheel now will the super tanker go in a different direction a mile from now. And so we may well see some opportunity to position for the longer term. I would just say be careful, because Europe is quite concerned about fossil fuel lock-in. And so any gas that comes in, the LNG terminals that are being built now across Europe, they're looking for floating terminals so that after 5 years, they can release them and not be wedded to natural gas.
Yeah.
They're asking that any turbines that are built be hydrogen ready, that is, they can use alternatives to natural gas going forward. And so these kinds of regulations and policies might be very onerous for countries and companies that don't want to take on the extra cost and responsibility of certifying that their upstream natural gas is very low fugitive emissions on methane, for example, something the European Commission has very strict rules they've just announced on all of this that may very well demand authentication, monitoring, certification in order to be allowed to sell in Europe some years from now, as well as actually how the infrastructure is built out may require extra money. It doesn't come for free to have a turbine that can handle 100% hydrogen. And so these are all factors that would come into play. However, the stronger financial players or those that have a better environmental posture may find advantage over the small fry. So this may be a real opportunity for the world-class companies to come in and take market shares, certainly from the Russians, but from others that might not be able to meet Europe's high standards. I actually think that there's a chance here that Europe will have what happened with the so-called GDPR rules on data privacy. We know how the Brussels effect, in effect, set the global rules for many countries that are cut and pasted around the world. And the Americans actually are the outlier at this point on data privacy issues, even though the companies of Silicon Valley are the main companies that we deal with outside of China. In the same way, when it comes to low greenhouse gas fuels, the future of fossil fuels in many countries, the rules might be set from Brussels, and many multinationals will follow them, making it very convenient for other countries to cut and paste those rules.
Very interesting. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and look at pick up on those future energy options, specifically around technology. There's a lot in the media around battery technology becoming an area of strategic importance, especially in this region, not only in engineering and tech, but also the availability of rare earth materials and their specific strategic importance. I'm interested in hearing from you where you see this area, energy storage and batteries, going, and if you can give our audience a flavour for what the energy mix could look like for developing companies in the region.
Sure. I think energy storage is one of the great areas of investment opportunity, innovation, and frankly, public good going forward if you take the long-term view. Now, there's a lot of interest specifically in lithium-based solutions, right? We all know the lithium-ion battery that every one of us has our smartphone in our pocket, our laptops at the ready. All your members who are busy doing emails at the moment while pretending to listen to me, if it wasn't for lithium-ion, you couldn't be doing your multitasking, folks. As well as the next evolution of lithium technology, we know, and the market's going to be driven very strongly by electric vehicles. We've really turned the corner in terms of market penetration, I would argue. China is a solid point of evidence, but as well in the US now, we can see, thanks to Tesla, but others as well, every major manufacturer is headed this way. And so and European regulations are favoring it very heavily. So the market for energy storage in the short to medium term will be driven by lithium technologies, as well as related technologies, solid state versions of lithium or derivatives of current lithium-ion technologies that are better in various ways, power density or cycle times. There's numerous issues, safety, that lithium-ion technology is not perfect today, but it is extremely good and getting better and getting cheaper, and self-pack costs have dropped 90% in the last 15 years, to give an example. And so that's going to drive innovation in this area. But I think the bigger opportunity set is actually to look at energy storage, and in particular, long duration energy storage. And this is grid scale stuff. And here, Australia is a world leader in many ways, along with California and certain parts of Europe, because what's going to drive that adoption is a fundamental transformation that's happening, will happen in the next 10 to 15 years on the power grids of the leading markets of the world because of advancing renewables penetration. When we have relatively low levels of intermittent renewables, wind and solar principally, it's not that big a deal to maintain stability on the grid with the old-fashioned way that we managed power, right? Centralized power plants, one-way flows of power, and passive consumers. That's the 100-year-old paradigm on the power grid. But once you start getting 30, 40, 50% penetration of renewables, and in some parts of certainly Australia, of California, and other parts of the world, we know Denmark famously for wind, you're getting those levels already. In fact, in the last month, we know at a moment in time, both Australia and California saw over 100% of instantaneous capacity used from renewables. You begin to have major challenges when the grid approaches 60, 70% of renewables penetration that can only be handled with big forms of energy storage. And the good news is there's lots of different approaches to energy storage: thermal, electrochemical, ultimately maybe even hydrogen, which is a form of chemical energy storage that can last for months and months. They're advancing pretty quickly, and a lot of them don't use rare earths or have the problem that we have with lithium-ion batteries. And so I see a real blunderbuss of innovation coming, and it will be deployed on the grid in the next decade, because without it, we're going to have significant problems with grid stability.
Yeah. Okay. Bertram has said, we are listening, Vijay. And he wants to ask, how are companies actually driving scale transition? There seem to be many small projects around. Are these going to be the unicorns of the future in your view? And where do you see these pockets of innovation in Asia?
Right. So an innovation question, which I love. And the question really doesn't have to be just about energy, right? I think it's a broader topic. My last book was about the future of innovation, called Need, Speed, and Greed. So I love this question. So I've thought about this a lot and studied lots of innovation efforts around the world. And what you find is that the world is not flat, even though we were told something to the contrary by a New York Times columnist. The world is lumpy. And there are clusters, and there are clustering effects, and it does matter. And so, there are going to be places, be that Shenzhen in hardware, Beijing with AI. Silicon Valley continues to have great strengths in different kinds of software, and even in climate tech, which is one of the hot new areas. You have centers like Boston, Berlin, but Silicon Valley is still one of the really important places, probably the dominant place, coming up with climate tech companies, interestingly. And so I think if you're small, you're likely to have this death by pilot phenomena. That is, small companies on their own find it very hard to scale. But if you move yourself to an ecosystem where you can find like-minded peers, even competitors, as well as funders, and easier access not only to capital, but to early markets, I think that's really the lessons of how innovation scales. Now, if you're talking about corporate funding, that is companies, multinationals of the sort that many of whom are on this call, trying to do innovation in-house, that's a slightly different question, right, than the unicorn question. And corporate innovation often has lots of little projects, and often they're killed by corporate culture, right? That's the problem. It's rare that you have a disruptive innovation come out of existing multinational that's profitable, in part because if it's a genuinely disruptive innovation, one that would come from the periphery in a classic sense that Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School meant disruptive innovation, it's very hard to see when you're the market leader or have successful offerings. You tend to gold plate your best offerings for your best customers. That's the innovator's dilemma that Christensen talked about. And if you actually find there's a new idea that will reduce the margins on your existing product, that is a disruption in the dictionary sense of the word, then existing antibodies are released within your company, is what the great Christensen told me once at an Economist conference. And they will attack the new ideas and defeat it because it disrupts the current profitability of the model. And so it's you need to think about ways of either spinning out the new idea or having an arm's length venture arm that invests in this company, but without dictating how to run the company. There are some examples like this. And when IBM, for example, which dominated the mainframe and midframe market, they were skeptical about personal computers. But when they were clever enough to set up a division to try out personal computing. They didn't keep it up in Armonk, New York. They set it up down in Boca Raton. They didn't give the guys very much money. They had to eat pizza and work out of shabby conditions. And they did come up with a good PC that served them well for many years. Of course, that business was later spun out to Lenovo, which continues to operate it. So, but it's rare that you find a successful incumbent actually being able to nurture small projects. They tend to end up in a death by pilot scenario.
Fascinating. Thank you, Bertrand, for the question. And audience, please do keep them coming. Let's go back to transition fuels, and I want to touch on hydrogen. What's the role for hydrogen in this low carbon future, and is the hype real?
There's a lot of hype about hydrogen. You're right. The way I think about hydrogen is as follows. Look, the way that decarbonization is likely to proceed, the deep decarbonization of the world, even with the stumbles and sideways moves that we may have because of the current energy shock. I mean, I think most reasonable people agree that if you take a 30-year view, we're going to need to find ways of decarbonizing the world. And what role fossil fuels will play in that is an open question, but they will continue to play some role in some decarbonized fashion, is my view. Hydrogen makes no sense at all if you can use clean energy instead, because there are energy penalties, right? Hydrogen is not an energy source. It's an energy carrier. It's like a fuel. And so you have to make it from something, and then often you have to transport it at great cost or energy penalty. And so you would never use hydrogen if you could just use renewable electricity directly. And so for most application, we'll probably decarbonize the grid, expand the grid, and then try to use as much renewable energy, and if we're sensible, nuclear or other kinds of zero carbon as well, although it's very politically controversial to say that. Certainly the Economist, we've supported that, and have a decarbonized grid that does as much as you can. But there's things that electricity can't do. Windmills and Teslas can't solve the problem of how to make steel, or high temperature industrial heat, or process chemistry, or places where you need the inputs that natural gas provides into actually the chemicals that are needed to make things like fertilizers, for example. So it's a very difficult problem. There are solutions that are in the offing, but hydrogen is one of those solutions because it can be used in combustion at high temperatures. It can be used in to support a lot of these industrial applications, the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors. So if you look out 20, 30 years, maybe 10, 15% of end-use fuels could end up being hydrogen. And at that point, probably most of it will be made from renewable sources, some form of zero carbon approach, probably renewables because they're so cheap and getting cheaper. But it might be some form of advanced nuclear as well, could play a role because again, that's a decarbonized approach. And if they can get the economics right for the next generation of nuclear, that's a possible route. I don't think we'll see there was a lot of enthusiasm about what's been called blue hydrogen that is making it from natural gas. The fugitive emissions problem is strong and has to be dealt with. And secondly, the outlook for natural gas, at least in the short term, the prices are quite high. There's many competing claims on that natural gas. So I think we may not see such an enthusiasm for making hydrogen from natural gas, especially because renewable costs are falling so fast that the economics may favor the so-called green hydrogen route, including long distance transport, that is shipping it from Australia to Europe, from Chile to parts of the world that need it, maybe in the form of ammonia, which is a natural carrier for hydrogen.
Yeah, you mentioned Australia there and a few other countries that are exporters of hydrogen, but I want to talk about Australia and Australia's role in clean energy. I mean, do you think we have the opportunity to become, a real powerhouse in terms of our green energy exports?
It would be ironic, given how much fossil fuels Australia consumes and how ambivalent Australia has been in pursuing carbon policies like carbon taxes and other forms of climate change policies. It's played the role of sort of the skunk at the garden party at gatherings like the UN summits and so on. But you can't argue, just as demography is destiny, I would argue in this case, sort of geography and natural endowments, natural resources also help shape destiny. And Australia has phenomenal resources when it comes to renewable energy. The fact that several decades of innovation and luck and German subsidies and Chinese scaling up have made solar and energy storage so affordable in tandem. I think it gives the opportunity for Australia, and we're going to see that same revolution now happen to electrolyzers, where basically it's a cottage industry so far. It's just entering the phase where solar was, say, in 2005 or 2010. I think we're going to see a dramatic professionalization, economies of scale, and scaling up and electrolyzers that are going to dramatically reduce the costs. When you put those pieces of the puzzle together, you begin to see Australia have quite an advantage in producing hydrogen. It could be just used locally, you don't have to ship it. But of course, there's such a thirst and demand that's going to develop around the world, where countries have made commitments to achieve net zero targets, and they don't have the ability to make their own hydrogen. Germany, for example, is among the lowest solar potential of any big country on earth, and yet they're committed to these very aggressive targets that they can't possibly meet at home with domestic hydrogen. And so they have to import. And the question is, will they import by pipeline from North Africa? They get it from the Middle East. The Saudis are very keen. They have maybe even a better endowment, arguably, than Australia does. There's a project called NEOM that's a $6 billion project in which you have both extremely low, the world's lowest solar prices at recent auctions have been bid in Saudi Arabia, as well as a matching wind at night. And so you actually have a perfectly matched system that produces incredibly cheap energy that's planned to be used for electrolysis to make green hydrogen. The economics of this, actually, the numbers work out to send it by pipeline to Europe. If you can get over the politics of building a pipeline from Arabia to Europe, it actually becomes economic. And so that may not happen. We'll probably see the stuff moved by ship as ammonia. But nevertheless, I think that those are the kinds of economics that Australia will have to compete against if it wants to be a superpower of clean energy. But I think it has as good a shot as any of the leading contenders.
Yeah, Vijay, you may know we're in an election cycle in Australia, and I know you've spoken with Kevin Rudd many times, but particularly on your podcast as well. And I mean, we may see a change of government this Saturday in Australia. Whether that changes the role of green energy or the policy on the international engagement front, I guess we'll see whether Australia, I've heard it called a weak link. I haven't heard it called a skunk at the garden party. That's a good one. But we'll see what COP27 brings, I guess, in terms of Australia's engagement internationally. Certainly some polling by the Lowy Institute in Australia indicates that 60% of Australians think that climate change is a major issue when it's happening now. And of course, we, like many places around the world, have seen such devastating climate impacts recently. So it will be, like I say, interesting to see whether, if there is a change of government, whether we see a change in Australia's international stance there. I've got a couple of more questions, but I do want to invite everyone on the call to send me your questions in. It doesn't just have to be about energy, as Bertram indicated there. Talking about innovation more generally, Vijay can give some insights and some ideas there in terms of investment opportunities and long-term outlooks. You mentioned hydrogen and Australia, and I want to raise some individuals, I guess, that have been really pushing the agenda there, particularly from Australia. We have Twiggy Forrest from Fortescue, who's repositioning the company and making substantial investments in sustainable energy. We have Mike Cannon-Brookes, the co-founder of Atlassian, very actively advocating for AGL, Australia's largest power generator, to transition the company into green energy. In the States, you have many sort of activist billionaires that get involved in various areas, and you mentioned Tesla and of course Musk's role in accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles, for example. I mean, how how important are these kinds of, leading business people in actually making a difference?
I think, we have a column in the latest Economist, actually. Our Schumpeter business column is exactly on this topic.
Great.
And what we have discovered and have argued is that while these gadflies and activist investors, Carl Icahn in the US is, of course, a famous one, but every major economy has several of them. They're megalomaniacs. They're obviously in it for the money. And, oftentimes you find them spouting sort of two sides of an argument to win their case. Careful studies have shown that activism lifts the returns for activists, but also long-term value for other shareholders. And so if you believe in capitalism and you believe in that companies belong to owners, not to managers, then it's good to have these gadflies and efforts to shut them down or to silence them. Interestingly, the US SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has recently proposed rules that would actually limit activists' ability to make their case to other shareholders and put up other sorts of barriers. That is not, I think, in the interests of shareholders. And so I think it's good to have some of them, however unpleasant they may be to the business elite, or even to however unpleasant they may be to have at a dinner party in your house. I think they keep capitalism honest, and they keep the managers of companies honest. Now, they're not necessarily only on one side of an issue, right? You give an example in Australia where you have one pushing for sort of a green activism tinge, but there's a new rearguard action in America where you're seeing activism on the other side of the fence. And so this is a proxy season in America, and a record number of activist actions are taking place, and you're seeing a rising number of, we can say, the conservative activists or anti-green activists making their case as well, and challenging companies that seem to be tilting too far in the direction of either ESG or so-called greenwashing. And so I think we're seeing the tools of activism. They don't belong only to those who want to see a climate agenda, let's say, or a certain kind of environmental agenda. They can be used by those who have other grievances or other kinds of issues to push for as well.
I'm inviting, I haven't seen any more questions pop up. Audience, do send them in. I don't want to capitalize on all of them. We have about 20 minutes left, and it will go quickly. So please do send your questions in if you've been holding on to some. Oh, here we go. Leonora, can we elaborate on a statement made earlier on in the discussion around the war in Ukraine, delaying the environmental agenda by 10 years?
Sure. So this is a concern. I'm not stating it as fact, but there is a real concern. Now, there's no denying that, for example, because of now the urgent need to get off of Russian gas, in several European countries, they're running their coal plants harder. That works against climate change, right? For obvious reasons. It's a much more carbon-intensive fuel. And their coal plants have been given permission to run at higher rates. And so that's an example of some tension, right? Europe, and in particular countries like Germany, were very anti-natural gas, right? In part because we now understand that methane, the principal component of natural gas, is much worse as a greenhouse gas in the short term, that is the next 10 to 20 years, than previously understood. We've seen the UN IPCC issue major warnings on this. We now have satellite data and other kinds of tracking that shows how much methane leaks upstream, as it were, during the development and shipping process, as well as even inside people's homes. We now understand that using natural gas in cooking, in my city where I live, New York, has banned new construction to have natural gas for cooking, for example, because of these concerns. And yet we now have, because of the need to get off of Russian natural gas, massive amounts of new gas infrastructure being approved and authorized in Europe. Germany, a green government and a green minister within a coalition government, the Traffic Light Coalition, it has just approved and fast-tracked LNG terminals. I mean, it's inconceivable, right? 6 months ago, to think that Germany would do this, never mind the Green Party would do this. And the worry there is that this fossil infrastructure, once built, will be in place for 20 years or more, right? Investors don't invest for 1 year just until we deal with the Russia problem.
Yeah.
Investors in these kinds of power plants and pipelines and regas facilities will expect a return for a normal amount of time, let's say a 20-year window. Contracts, long-term contracts, as previously mentioned, and so the worry is what's called fossil lock-in. And what happens after the immediate crisis passes, you're still getting the gas, you're still burning it in a power plant, unless you take extraordinary measures to make sure that you future-proof it or get off of it, or you end up basically stranding those assets and having to pay off those investors from the taxpayer purse, because in effect you'd be confiscating them, right? And so not enough thought has been put into this. And so, and part of my argument is that unless Europe puts a lot more thought into this in making clear how it's going to sunset some of these fossil assets, this will actually divert from its own stated goals. And the official position in Brussels is that, and this is also the International Energy Agency, the IEA, the official position is the war that Russia has started in Ukraine will only accelerate the energy transition. It's reminded us of how unsavory and unreliable fossil fuel suppliers can be, and therefore we need to double down and accelerate our move towards renewable energy. And that's the official position. And in fact, the Commission this week has actually announced new goals for a program it calls Repower EU, where they've increased their renewables targets, their hydrogen goals using green hydrogen. And so that's the official position. But while the left hand is doing this, the right hand is saying we'll have more gas, and oh, by the way, please build some more LNG terminals. And so my point is, we need to look at the entire system and say, hold on a minute. If you're going to do more fossil fuels, and ensure that they're climate compatible, because otherwise they'll undermine your project for 20 years to try to move off of some of these fossil fuels. Gas was meant to be a bridge fuel. And so what is it a bridge to if you're still using it in an unmodified way 20 years from now?
Yeah, fantastic. I have a question here from Kara. Any chance you could comment on carbon capture, whether it's whether feasible and which jurisdictions it's possible?
Sure. I mean, it's a broad topic in the sense that obviously we can geek out on this, which I won't, but there are multiple ways to approach carbon capture. Broadly speaking, we have nature-based solutions, which involve forests and sinks and so on, agriculture, different new methods. But I suspect that the questioner means what's called direct air capture from the air. That is chemistry-based methods to use. Bill Gates has a company in this space. A number of others are using carbon capture to try to fill the breach. As well, there's point source carbon capture within industrial processes, either at power plants or chemical plants and so on. And that's an area of great intensity and innovation. And so I think we need to have a lot more experiments and innovation. None of this is at scale, of course, it has to be said, but they've been proven in the lab. They all work, and some of them are at pilot stage. There's even an interesting example of Occidental Petroleum, which is, of course, an American mid-sized oil company, that they are funding the first commercial scale roll-up of direct air capture at a project in Texas that's going on right now. And so we're seeing interesting, and of course, at Gorgon, we've had CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, led by Chevron and others, but that project was not very successful. They did not meet their own internal goals. So I think we're going to have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find the prince when it comes to direct air capture. But even the United Nations and the environmental community that had been deeply skeptical about direct air capture now acknowledges that we've run out of time on climate, that simply doing mitigation, that is reducing emissions, will not be enough. We need to have negative emissions when you take a 30-year view. And for negative emissions, that is, we have to find ways to remove emissions that we put in the air in the very long term, and continue to do that for decades or centuries onwards. We're going to need to have technologies like direct air capture perfected. It may not happen tomorrow, but we'd better be sure we have it ready 10, 20, 30 years from now. So I favor heavy investments, including taxpayer-funded money, to scale up. That's really what we need, is to scale up the many good ideas that are coming out of the laboratories and academia and startups, to have major commercials and to have 100 of them scaled up, so that we know which 2 or 3 might be the most promising. And that is a public good. because we're going to need it. Otherwise, it won't be ready 10 years from now or 20 years from now.
Yeah. Talking about scale, can you talk to us a little more about China's path to a sustainable future? They're the world's manufacturer, and how they respond to the challenge of energy transition will impact us all. Where are they on the journey? What are the positive signs and also your greatest concerns?
Yeah, having lived in China for so many years, Stephanie, we first got to know each other when we lived in Shanghai, of course. You need to be able to hold two opposing thoughts in your head at the same time without your head exploding, right? China is the biggest builder of coal plants and burner of coal today. More than half of the climate contribution from coal will come from China going for, at the moment, at a time when much of the world is growing wary of coal use. At the same time, it's the world's biggest builder and user of solar panels, of energy efficiency, and lighting, of biggest innovator in batteries and energy storage, and so on. And so both things are true. And wind, of course, China is using a lot. And deploying them, not just selling them to the world while remaining dirty. China is a hotbed of not necessarily original invention, but certainly what innovation means, which is creating value from inventions. China is a place where we can see the massive scale, the state grid, the world's largest electric grid, with its use of smart meters, AI, ML, automated controls, HVDC cables for very long distance transmission. I think we see a huge amount of development and deployment of the kinds of things that we need to make the clean energy economy of the future work. And there's an export potential to many of these things as well. And so many parts of the emerging world will be benefiting from China having experimented, figured out how to roll these out, make these different clean technologies in mobility and grid service and so on, as well as monitoring, and make them available at prices that are affordable in the developing world. And so I think China will have a huge impact in helping green the world. At the same time, we have to judge its seriousness, because if there's one elephant in the room when it comes to climate, you can see a cover story on the wall behind me. It might be too small for the audience to read, but it says coal, environmental enemy number one. I wrote that cover story 20 years ago in The Economist.
Wow.
And you could basically run it again today.
I thought it was recent.
No, it's 20 years ago. And because the carbon content of the coal is just so much greater, not to mention 100 other local pollutants, mercury and other nasty, several million people a year die from coal emissions. And so it is really environmental enemy number one still, but particularly when it comes to climate. If coal in Asia, particularly China, but Indonesia and India, of course, vast amounts of coal and a propensity to use it are not phased out. And with proper incentives, political, economic, and otherwise financial, then there's no point doing any of the other stuff. The game is lost on climate. That is the volume of potential greenhouse warming that's contained in the coal in Asia that Asia has or will buy from Australia and other places to burn. And so I think that's a problem we have to come to grips with. And let's see, I think the next 3 years will make clear China's intentions. If it, at the moment, there are numerous coal plants that are slated to come online. They are new and they're more efficient and they're better than the old ones. If they displace them, take a lot of old coal plants offline, as we hope. If they're able to do a dash to gas, we know that China is an enthusiastic adopter of natural gas, whether it's piped gas from Russia or LNG from Russia or other parts of the world. If we begin to see much more switching, as well, of course, as the vast expansion of renewables. But as long as coal continues to play as big a role as it does in key Asian economies, and America, it must be noted, still uses a big chunk of coal, I think that the climate game is going to be much more difficult.
I have a question here from Michael, and it links to China around nuclear energy, and they're asking for your views. You mentioned earlier The Economist, supports the role of nuclear in the clean energy mix, but perhaps you could just offer some commentary on that as well.
Sure. Yeah. China is the most enthusiastic supporter and builder of new nuclear plants in the world at the moment, and I think that's a good thing. Nuclear technology is mature, generally speaking. Certainly the kind that China is building. It's not the experimental stuff that we see from Bill Gates or some of the other small modular reactors that people are getting excited about. That is in development phase. It will take more than a decade, maybe 15 years to have a commercial impact. But Electricité de France is, of course, another big user of nuclear. And Macron, recently re-elected, has committed to keeping up the fleet of nuclear power in France and to renovate it. And so that's a good sign as well. We see several other countries in Europe now keeping more open mind on nuclear. The problem with nuclear is not safety. We know far more people have died by orders of magnitude because of coal burning than because of nuclear power. There's no doubt about that. We know pretty much how to do geological disposal. So it's not a problem of waste, really. We know how to do that. There's no technical challenge. The problem is economics. It's the most expensive way to boil water, is the old joke in the industry. And worse yet, after 50 years, unlike solar and wind, which had dramatic reductions in cost, what's called learning by doing, right? Those of you listening who are involved in innovation will know what that means. You get better and you make mistakes and you learn, you copy, there's the spillover effects. That's how innovation works. There's a massive learning by doing effect in solar and batteries and in wind. This is an industry that, far from learning by doing, is forgetting by doing. That is, new nuclear plants are more expensive than the one that came before, even adjusting for inflation. They're getting dumber and more expensive, and so it's crazy. And of course, the reasons for this have a lot to do with the regulatory process. It have to do with NIMBYism, lawsuits, public acceptance, and so. And there has not been a whole lot of breakthrough innovation. That's the hope of some of the smaller modular reactors. Britain has given a go-ahead for Rolls-Royce to build a number of them. They're even more passively safe, next generation designs. But that's going to take 10, 15 years to get there. We should bet on those. We should encourage the development of those, because we're probably going to want something other than 100% renewables grid, which is quite risky. We're probably for 10 to 20% of our electricity, it would be good to have other sources. Nuclear would be a good bet. If you're lucky enough to have big hydro or geothermal, great. That's because that can provide baseload energy. Highly intermittent sources of energy are always going to pose a challenge to the grid. And the idea of 100% renewables is now very fashionable among Greens. I would say be careful what you ask for, right? Because it poses enormous challenges to grid integrity, grid security. And so batteries can help, but so too can other kinds of firm power like the next generation of nuclear.
Fantastic. Okay, we have a couple of people that have had to drop off, but we still have a substantial number here. And I'm going to ask one last question, Vijay, to you. You're deeply immersed in energy and innovation every single day. I'd love to hear from you. What's the most interesting development in this space that you've been exposed to in the last 12 months, a kind of aha for yourself?
So there's something that I'd mentioned. I've gone out to Texas to the Permian Basin, and there is a phenomenal amount of innovation in what's called methane tech, or at least I'm going to call it methane tech. Okay. That is how to use fossil fuels in a way that's climate consistent, consistent with the objectives of trying to deal with the climate change. Measuring, monitoring satellite data, there are airplanes that are measuring leaks, but also how to deal with the leaks with compressor valves and, very fiddly stuff, right? All the way down to future-proofing kit. And so if we can find a way to use some kinds of fossil fuels, coal probably have a very hard challenge, and burning oil in a combustion engine, you're never going to be able to deal with the emissions problem as long as you burn the oil in an internal combustion engine. But I think we need to get out of the old left versus right, green versus oil or fossil fuel mindset and say, let's be pragmatic. If the solution is we need to decarbonize and deal with the climate-related emissions, it's quite possible that fossil fuels can play a role in that, but we need to do them the right way. And not as greenwashing or not as a chimera. And so there's a phenomenal amount of interest in this, and including some important environmental groups like Environmental Defense Fund out of the US is supporting so-called methane tech, including sending up its own satellite to do observations of where the methane leaks are so they can be spotted and dealt with. And so I think there's a new kind of constructivism coming in rather than obstruction protectionism that we saw in the past. And I think that points a way for us to see how we can harness the engineering talent, the resources, the acumen of the traditional energy industry, rather than just make them as pariahs and leading to energy shortages and crisis, which is probably going to lead to more power for the parastatal actors like the OPEC cartel. If you drive the publicly traded energy companies like Exxon or Chevron or the BHPs out of the game, then you're going to end up with power in private hands, family-run companies, as well as the state-owned enterprises. And I think you're going to have worse outcomes when it comes to dealing with climate. And better to keep the talent engaged from multinational companies and going in the right direction. Keep them honest, but I think having them as part of the solution is more promising than driving them out. And that, to me, I think could be a real engine of new kinds of innovation.
Fabulous. Vijay, anything that looks towards a more constructive way that everyone can address decarbonisation and meet those climate goals, I think should be warmly embraced. I agree with you there. And, you know, we covered a lot of ground here today, went deep into some topics. We could probably talk for another few hours, I know myself, but we're hitting up on time. So I'm going to thank you officially on behalf of AustCham Hong Kong for sharing your time with us this evening over there in New York. We really appreciate your time, your insights. I know our members were really enthusiastic about this. Thank you to our audience for joining. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank again our members, especially our Platinum patrons, for their support of the Chamber. If this is the first time that you joined and you liked what you heard, I invite you to join us as a member and follow us on LinkedIn and become part of our community. Vijay, that's it from us. Good night to you. Thanks again.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thanks so much. Good night. Bye-bye.